Happy holidays, and welcome to ShockOrama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today I'd like to start a new tradition. Or rather, I'd like to bring back a very old tradition. Christmas is upon us, and this year I'd like to celebrate with a ghost story, because nothing gets me feeling cozier than drinking hot cocoa on a dark night while listening to a story that makes my hair stand on end. Christmas ghost stories have been around for a very long time, and I'm sure the first thing that springs to mind for most people would be the Charles Dickens story, A Christmas Carol. And while I love A Christmas Carol, I'd like to talk about a different British ghost story today. Back in the 1970s, a director named Lawrence Gordon Clark, mostly known at the time as a documentary director, approached the BBC with his idea for a Christmas special. As a young boy, he'd grown up listening to his father reading him the ghost stories of M.R. James. And they'd made such an impression on him that he wanted to try his hand at adapting some of these stories for the screen. This turned out to be a popular enough idea that it turned into a strange one-episode-a-year series called A Ghost Story for Christmas. The first episode of the series was The Stalls of Barchester, an adaptation of the M.R. James short story, The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral. It stars Robert Hardy, who you may recognize as Cornelius Fudge from the Harry Potter movies, or as Winston Churchill from a number of different television productions. Hardy plays Archdeacon Haynes, a dangerously ambitious man whose mysterious death becomes a subject of interest to a researcher 50 years later. The film is suspenseful and masterfully atmospheric thanks to Lawrence Gordon Clark's delicate touch and the hard work of the many talented technicians that were hired by the BBC to help create this experiment in Yuletide terror. Though this film is a true slow burner and a departure from the usual cheese fests that I cover on this channel, I hope you'll stick with me as we dim the lights and settle in for this delightfully creepy tale. This made-for-TV movie starts with a title card over a shot of our titular Barchester Cathedral, played by the real-life Norwich Cathedral in Norwich, England. We follow Dr. Black as he enters the large library archives, where he has been hired to create a catalogue of all the written works contained therein. Dr. Black is played by Clive Swift, who sadly passed away in 2019. Swift was a classically trained actor who performed with the Royal Shakespeare Company, as well as appearing in numerous TV shows, including the 90s sitcom Keeping Up Appearances. He also appeared in the 2007 episode of Doctor Who, Voyage of the Damned, which I thought was relevant since that was also a Christmas special. He would appear once again as Dr. Black in the next installment of A Ghost Story for Christmas, an adaptation of the M.R. James story A Warning to the Curious, which I will hopefully be covering this time next year. Dr. Black settles in at a desk and begins going through documents. He explains in voiceover that he has so far been disappointed in the contents of the cathedral's library, not having found anything interesting. The librarian comes in to check on him, and he even goes as far as to propose a tax on writers.
I sometimes wonder whether there shouldn't be a tax on authors. Mere poverty seems to be insufficient to deter them from writing.
He's joking, but still, the books he's going through surely can't be that bad. The librarian thinks he can show Dr. Black something that will be of interest to him. He leads him further into the library and starts pulling out some manuscripts and documents, none of which seem to meet Dr. Black's exceedingly high literary standards. That is, until he pulls out a locked chest that had been given to the cathedral by a Letitia Haynes, brother of a former archdeacon who had died under mysterious circumstances.
His death, as I remember, was hardly becoming to the cloth.
Most unfortunate, the whole affair. And unexplained.
Apparently, the former dean had even felt that the cathedral should not have accepted the chest, and had insisted that it never be opened while he was still alive. So of course the current librarian and Dr. Black immediately opened the box. M.R. James was a churchman himself, but he did still occasionally like to poke fun at the inner politics of the church. The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral is a perfect example of this, as we soon shall see. Inside the chest, they find several documents, including a large dusty book which proves to be the Archdeacon Haynes's personal diary, spanning the years that he was Archdeacon of Barchester Cathedral. Dr. Black begins reading, and we are transported some 50 or 60 years back to when Dr. Haynes and his sister Letitia first arrived in Barchester. Through voiceover, we learn of Haynes's ambitions of becoming the archdeacon of the cathedral. We also learn that the then current archdeacon, a Dr. Pulteney, would live to a very great age. There's an honestly really funny montage as we see Haynes getting increasingly irritated that Dr. Pulteney hasn't died yet, and he keeps getting invited to all of Pulteney's birthday gatherings. And there's this great gag where we see at his 84th birthday, there's a group of 4 or 5 men there to celebrate, but at his 90th, there's only 3 of them, including Haynes and Pulteney. And Pulteney just has this shit-eating grin on his face, like he's thinking, I'm gonna outlive all of you bastards. Eventually, Haynes has had enough waiting.
It was not until Dr. Pulteney had reached the age of 92 that he unwillingly vacated his position.
Dr. Pulteney trips on the stairs and falls to his death. His maid walks in, sees his body, looks and sees the missing stair rod, and then screams. That was an interesting little beat. At the Haynes household, Letitia is telling her brother about some of the local gossip. She suspects that the maid had killed Dr. Pulteney on purpose, since she had allegedly known about the missing stair rod, but hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She also wonders aloud who the next archdeacon will be, saying that it had been discovered that Pulteney had been failing in his duties to maintain the church, and was actually 12 years overdue in paying his dues. Haynes rebukes his sister for such distasteful gossip immediately after the archdeacon's unfortunate death. But look at that smug face. He is so ready to be archdeacon. Haynes gets what he wanted, and we see him leading the congregation of the cathedral in prayer, now as the archdeacon. We also see him exchange a brief but meaningful look with the former archdeacon's maid. These two are in cahoots, all right. Back in present day, the librarian has come in to check on Dr. Black and see if he's found anything interesting yet. Dr. Black explains that the first 3 years of Haynes's diary after becoming archdeacon mainly deal with his administrative duties at the cathedral. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, Dr. Black does note that Haynes was an exceedingly busy man, and it almost seems like he was filling his days with activity to distract himself from his fears at night. Back in the Haynes story, his sister Letitia is leaving Barchester to go to Brighton for the winter. She tells Haynes that she feels that they've both been in Barchester for too long and he should consider retiring, but Haynes won't hear it. He declares that he won't let the cathedral fall back into the state of disrepair that his predecessor had allowed. Letitia leaves and Haynes is now alone in the large, dark house. After Letitia leaves, Haynes notices the former archdeacon's maid walking outside, and he gets a sudden vision of the former archdeacon's death, which causes him to shudder. In present day again, Dr. Black finds a letter addressed to Haynes, asking him to send more money to the author, otherwise she will reveal some terrible secret about him. Dr. Black and the librarian think for a few moments before realizing that this must have been written by the maid. The maid's name had been Jane Lee, and there were indeed several payments coming from Haynes's account to a JL starting after he had become archdeacon. So just in case anyone is still confused, Haynes had paid the archdeacon's maid to remove the stair rod causing him to fall to his death. This is what one might refer to as a dick move. Dr. Black continues reading the diary. Haynes writes that with Letitia gone, his nights have been very trying. One night as he goes up the stairs, he hears voices from somewhere inside the house. He writes that he knows this can be a symptom of, as he calls it, incipient decay of the brain, which would be reassuring to him, except that he does not believe there's anything wrong with himself. Well, Mr. My Mental Health is Great is literally jumping at shadows, as he writes in his next diary entry that the first night that the candles had to be lit for evening prayer came as a shock to him. As he sits in his stall during the service, he begins drifting off to sleep with his hand resting on a carving of a cat. In this half-dreaming state, the carving suddenly turns into a real black cat, causing him to cry out. When he looks around, the carving has returned to normal. Later, after the service, we see that Haynes is hanging back in the church as the caretaker, Matthew, puts out all the candles. He asks Matthew about the carvings at his stall and gets an unusual response. Matthew describes them as nasty little things and says that he feels they have no place in a house of the Lord. This conversation turns into Matthew giving Haynes an impromptu tour of all the carvings in the church. The blessed in heaven are rendered on one side of the church, while the damned in hell are rendered on the other. there. Haynes remarks that the damned seem to have been carved with more conviction than the blessed, which Matthew agrees with. Underneath all the folding benches in the choir stalls are carved representations of the 7 deadly sins. Then we learn something interesting. All of the carvings in the church date back to the 14th century, except for the 2 at the archdeacon's stall. There had apparently been a fire, and the archdeacon's stall had needed to be restored. So those 2 carvings date to the 17th century. This is never brought up in the film, but I found it odd that the fire seemed to only have damaged the archdeacon's stall. That's a very small and specific area to be damaged by something as chaotic as a fire. Haynes is particularly interested in his stall's carvings after the strange incident he'd had earlier, and Matthew tells him that the wood for the carvings had been sourced from a nearby area referred to as the Holy Wood. Presumably the next day, Haynes ventures out to see this holy wood for himself. I say presumably because the diary entries have a tendency to leap forward quite a bit. Sometimes Dr. Black will skip over several months at a time because nothing of interest was recorded. So it's a little hard to say what the exact time frame of this story is. We know that Haynes has been archdeacon at this point for over 3 years, but I can't get much more specific than that. Accompanying Haynes in the Holywood is an elderly local man who knows quite a bit about the history of the location, and he provides us with some very interesting exposition. He tells Haynes that the Holywood had been the site of numerous pagan rites back in the old days, and the specific tree that had been the source of the wood for the carvings in the archdeacon's stall had been called the hanging oak. When it was cut down, human remains had been found among the roots, and it was clear that this was a site where human sacrifice had been practiced. Haynes is clearly disquieted by this information, but being the rational modern man he is, he says that in pre-Christian times this is understandable.
In pre-Christian times, of course, one understands.
Within living memory, my dear sir.
There are apparently some in the local community who still remember leaving little trinkets as offerings for good luck at the site of the hanging tree. When Haynes asks if this is still done, the old man replies that to his knowledge the old ways have died out. But the way he says this is brilliant, because he's kind of avoiding directly answering the question, which I interpret as meaning that there still may be some people who practice the old ways to this day, just in secret. This is my favorite scene in the movie because of how it gets into folk horror territory, and I love folk horror. This story is also a great example of a common theme that runs across many of M.R. James's ghost stories, where he has a highly rational, academic, intellectual man who feels that he knows better than to believe in silly superstitions, being brought down by those very superstitions, sometimes fatally. The carvings had apparently been made by a man named John Austin, who'd been nicknamed Austin the Twiceborn, due to his reputation for having the gift of second sight. There's also a small mistake in this scene that I wanted to point out. In the original story, Austin the Twiceborn had made 3 carvings: the cat, the devil, and death. However, in the movie, there are only 2 carvings, the cat and death. I assume this was either done for simplicity or due to budgetary constraints, since those carvings would have had to be handmade specifically for this film, and the BBC provided a very tiny budget of only about £8,000. However, in this scene in the Holywood, the old man references John Austin making 3 carvings, so clearly someone missed this in the shooting script. We skip forwards once again in the diary to just after midnight, New Year's Day. Haynes is returning home late from a get-together at the deanery, and as he enters the house, we see a large black cat disappear around a corner. When Haynes goes up the stairs, he is overwhelmed by a raspy voice. It's hard to tell, but I like to think that this is the voice of Dr. Pulteney that Haynes is hearing. About 2 weeks later, Haynes has a similar incident when he leaves his watch in the study and has to go back down to get it late at night. As he's going back up the stairs, he trips over that same black cat and hears a voice again telling him to take care. Well, now the ghost is just being an asshole. You were the one who tripped him, you jerk. We get another little detour into the present day with Dr. Black, as he points out to the librarian that you can now visibly see the mental decline of Archdeacon Haynes in his diary, as there are now numerous entries where he has written over and over again the words, "I must be firm, I must be firm." A bit reminiscent of The Shining, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I guess in this case, All work and no play makes Archdeacon Haynes a scared boy. Although interesting to note, this actually predates The Shining, since the Stephen King book was published in 1977 and this movie came out in 1971 and is based off a short story which was published in 1910. Haynes continues to hear disturbing noises in his house at night, and then again at evening prayers he has another terrifying experience with the carvings at his stall. This time it is the carving of Death that becomes a real hooded skeleton beneath his hand. He writes in his diary that this is surely some sign of a physical affliction within him, though he is definitely getting less sure of himself at this point. Another night, Haynes is walking alone through the cathedral halls when he hears another set of footsteps following him. He quickens his pace until he is nearly running and almost bumps into Matthew the caretaker. Matthew asks him if that was Canon Arnold with him, since he wanted to ask the Canon Arnold a question, but Haynes insists, maybe a little too forcefully, that no one was with him.
No one was with me. No one!
I'm very sorry, sir.
On yet another night, Haynes is having fitful sleep, hearing voices both from his real life and the usual ghostly whispers he's been hearing in his house. Suddenly, he's standing with his eyes closed at the top of the stairs, and we see a demonic-looking hand reach out to grab his shoulder. Haynes wakes with a fright and stares around in terror as we see a ghostly cat disappear around the corner. So now we started sleepwalking, so that's fun. We switch back to present day yet again, and unfortunately, I think this is the weakest part of the narrative structure. This style of framing device works great in short stories, and I've seen it in quite a few that I've read over the years, but on the screen, I think it only serves to really slow down the action. And in a story like this, which is a slow burn by its nature, it really doesn't work. But at least we get a great performance from Clive Swift, who proves to be a memorable part of the movie. Dr. Black and the librarian are looking at yet another entry that ends with repeated "I must be firms," and they begin debating Haynes's mental state. The librarian insists that these are nothing more than the ramblings of a man who has been slowly descending into madness over his guilt at killing his predecessor, but Dr. Black isn't so sure. He points out that there are other people who have been experiencing these same phenomena that Haynes has been experiencing. And he moves on to the next entry, where Haynes's cousin Alan had spent the night, and the next morning had described the house as very noisy. And of course there was also the episode we just saw where Matthew thought that there was someone else with Haynes. Haynes's cousin Alan had also apparently made a comment about his cat, saying it was, quote, "a very large and fine specimen, but very wild," end quote. The night after Alan leaves, Haynes is alone again in the big house, except for his servant John. Haynes asks John to come to his room before going to sleep to pick up a letter that he wants delivered to the bishop early the next morning. As Haynes sits at his bed, he hears a whisper at the door. Thinking that it's John, Haynes invites him in. The door opens, but no one is there. Haynes goes and looks in the hallway and sees a figure disappearing around a corner. He calls for John, and John comes in from the opposite direction. Haynes takes his candle and goes and looks around the corner, but sees no one there, just a dead end. He goes back and asks John about the cat, but John says they've never had a cat, and to his knowledge there has never been a cat in the house. Haynes dismisses John, I guess forgetting about that important letter that he'd wanted delivered. I mean, I totally would forget about that too if I was being haunted, but I'm still gonna make fun of Haynes for it. With the next diary entry, we actually see Haynes writing it out, and he breaks the nib of his pen with the force with which he writes, "I must be firm." Whoa there, buddy. You might be being a little too firm if you ask me. When he hears a noise in the hallway, he lights a candle with shaking hands and nervously goes to investigate. There's nothing there, but when he starts going up the stairs, he hears a meow and turns around to see a black cat walking down the hallway where he'd just been. When he turns back, he is face to face with the hooded figure of Death from his carving. Death reaches its arms towards him and viciously scratches the side of Haynes's face. Haynes falls down the stairs and breaks his neck, closely mirroring the way that he'd had Dr. Pulteney killed. With Haynes's story having reached its unnatural conclusion, we are back again in the present as Dr. Black reads aloud the official report of the Archdeacon's death. The report reads that the community had been horrified by the state in which Haynes's body had been discovered, and that the culprits of the murder were never found. The report ends, stating that the entire occurrence would be forever shrouded in mystery. Dr. Black isn't satisfied with this, though, and decides to do a bit of snooping on his own to see if he can learn anything else. He heads to the cathedral and sees that all of the carvings on the walls and under the choir stalls are exactly as Haynes had described them in his diary. Only the Archdeacon's stall is different, since there are no carvings and it looks like it was very recently restored. Next, he heads to the cathedral's museum to visit with the curator, who he had learned off-screen is likely the last person to have seen the carvings. Unfortunately, when he gets there, the curator tells him that he had never seen the carvings in person, only heard them described, but he does have something interesting pertaining to them. He tells Dr. Black that when the carvings were being removed, one of them had been dropped and broke open, revealing a piece of paper inside. He takes out that piece of paper and shows it to Dr. Black, who reads this on the page. "When I grew in the wood, I was watered with blood. Now in the church I stand. Who that touches me with his hand, if a bloody hand he bear, I counts of him beware, lest he be fetched away, whether by night or day, but chiefly when the wind blows high, in a night of February. This I dreamt 26th of February, 1699. John Austin." Dr. Black asks the curator if the carvings still exist, but he tells him that the last owner had had them burned because of how badly they frightened his children. Dr. Black heads out and walks along the cathedral grounds, passing by a cat as the credits begin to roll. And that is how the movie ends. I know this movie has a very different vibe from the kinds of movies I normally cover on this channel, but I thought it would be kind of a nice way to celebrate the holidays by switching things up a little bit. Unlike all the other movies I've covered, this one is actually well made and well acted, and even though it had a very small budget, it doesn't look cheaply made. Lawrence Gordon Clark did an excellent job of capturing feelings of unease and dread evoked by the original story, though I think there were some aspects he could have done better. As much as I love Clive Swift's performance as Dr. Black, I think the story would have been better if they had dispensed with the framing device and focused purely on Haynes' part of the story. The diversions to Dr. Black and the librarian really didn't do the pacing any favors, and I think relied too heavily on a tell-don't-show approach that works better on the page than on the screen. It would have been better if we had gotten more extended scenes, perhaps showing Haynes writing out one of the payments to the maid, or maybe the whole thing could have ended with us seeing them removing the carvings and us seeing the letter inside the carving when it breaks open. The montage where we see Haynes getting increasingly annoyed that Pulteney won't die of old age didn't exist in the original story, and it works really well in the movie, so I think Lawrence Gordon Clark could have gone even further with that style of storytelling for this movie. Ultimately, I'm a huge fan of this movie, and I'm excited to delve into the rest of the Ghost Stories for Christmas series over the next few years. I hope you all enjoyed it too, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I've got some very exciting projects coming up in 2025, and we will be getting back to our regularly scheduled schlock in January with a little movie called Extraterrestrial Visitors. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video and want to see more. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and as always, stay weird.
And Kwanzaa.
Oh my God.